I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Matt Bernico.
And I'm your other co-host, Dean Detloff.
All right, folks, we survived Halloween. We're through it all. We love it so much, but it's gone.
Good riddance. Too spooky, am I right?
It's too spooky. All of the mummies and vampires and ghosts, they're gone for now, but they'll be back. Don't you worry. No one's worried about this.
No one's worried about it. Did you? What's your number one Halloween highlight, though, Matt?
Nothing. I got to eat candy. That's the highlight. That's all it is, man. I ate I ate a lot of little Snickers. I could have eaten one regular Snickers, but I think they taste better when they're fun size. Yeah. And my son can't eat them because he's allergic to peanuts, so I got him. I got all the Snickers in a big pile, and that's great.
That's the highlight. You gotta figure out how many little Snickers equal one big Snickers.
Yeah, I don't want to know because I'm sure I ate that many at least. What about you, Dean? Yeah. What was your big Halloween high point?
We took a 16-month-old baby friend of ours. It's weird to put it that way. Just a good buddy of ours around a rich neighborhood of Toronto, and that was great. Seeing all those big, rich decorations in big, rich houses, asking for rich people's candy. It was, a extremely modest effort to redistribute some wealth. And
did you get any full-size candy bars?
There are a few, although you could tell that the parents were like, we know that this child is not going to get them. So it's just like a wink and a nod. Thanks for that one.
That's great. It's just parents conspiring with other parents to make sure that at least somebody gets to eat some candy, even if it's not your kids.
Exactly.
Great. It's fantastic. And it'll happen again next year. And it'll be just as good as this time, I'm sure. But in church time, this past week marks a different type of holiday, one that's not as exciting as Halloween, less candy, called All Saints Day. And let's see, if you're not a Christian person, you probably don't know what that is, or maybe you do. I don't know you in your life, but anyways, if you don't know, it is a moment where we're supposed to sort of remember the lives of the people who have kind of gone before us and led sort of strong, faithful, and moral lives and kind of shown us the way. And I don't know what that might actually mean. Can mean like a lot of different things. Like at my church, it's like sort of a longer sort of time where the priest is sort of reading off names of loved ones who've passed, recently or not so recently. And it's nice. It's a whole nice thing. But in a different way of thinking, it is a certain like moment where we as people who are there in those moments are kind of like informed about what types of possible lives and politics there might be for you as a Christian person, right? It's like all of these people have lived before you and gone before you, and they've sort of set like a standard, or like they've set an example, and maybe you could kind of you could do that too if you really wanted to. Dean, is that your experience? Is that All Saints Day for you too? I don't know. Is it different in the Catholic Church? I couldn't tell you.
No, I think it's pretty much the same. Pretty much the same. You think about the saints, you figure out what you got to do to be a saint and hope for the best, I guess, as you look down the line toward Advent. But yeah, no, I think you're right. Right, especially if you're on the left or you're a Christian person, just trying to think about how to be a person who cares about making a better world. It is an opportunity to reflect on what resources are available in not just the Christian tradition, but maybe in our own lives too. Right, connecting us to our own ancestors maybe in some way or loved ones, and then connecting us again to that like deep well of church memory or church archives of people who did wild stuff. Right,
Yeah.
and the point is to maybe activate those passions inside you to get you to be like, maybe I could be a person who does some wild stuff. And I think there's a lot of potential in a day like that, even though it can maybe get lost in the the routine of the liturgy.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's an interesting time, right? You're not just remembering your ancestors, or the people who went to church and have passed on or whatever, but you're remembering all the saints within Christian history and all of just the buck wild things they got up to. For example, I mean, if you're a person on the left, this can mean a lot of very interesting things, and also maybe a lot of conflicting things as well. But you might remember a few weeks ago we talked about Saint Francis and how his particular witness and canonization means that the rejection of private property is definitely within the realm of possibility for Christian life, right? There's this guy who is kind of against wealth and thought that people sort of, I mean, clergy especially should forego all of it, and he was canonized. A real person who didn't believe in private property, canonized in the church. Pretty cool. And I think that's important because those set up a certain type of possibility, right? Um, people on the right like people on the right of Christianity will, they'll say things like socialism, and Christianity, they don't go together. There's nothing there. There's there's just contradictions, et cetera, et cetera. But like you can actually go back to the, I don't know, different saints and say, look, I don't know, you might not like me as a person or my politics, but this guy who is, in your religion is a communist and in church history, and there's nothing you can do about it.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know. That's like that's important, I guess. So I think that kind of brings us around to a particular idea that man, it's hard to say maybe a good starting point for like where you'd find this place, but I think it is definitely like a postmodern idea, or at least it's an idea that has a lot of traction in postmodern philosophy called political imagination. This is like a phrase that people throw around a lot, and it can be a really complicated topic for people interested in Marxist philosophy for sure, because it's about your imagination. It's about the ideal. It's really easy to get.
The one thing Marxists hate more than anything else: ideals and imagination.
They hate them. They hate them so much. Yeah, I mean, there is a certain way you could talk about political imagination that is probably too idealistic, or maybe not materialist enough. I don't know. You got to just strike that good balance, Not really.
The perfect balance.
That's right. Yeah. But all that's being said, I think that for me, in my own particular walk with Marxist philosophy, political imagination has always been kind of a helpful idea for thinking about like why people get so stuck in bad ideas and like and not being able to kind of break out of their weird ideas about capitalism and the morality around that sort of thing. So I thought that it'd be good to think through that idea a bit more deeply. And then, just as I was thinking that, I picked up the October issue of the Monthly Review, which is a great socialist magazine that you can go read yourself. And there is actually an essay in the newest issue about the political imagination and history and time and how all these things work together. So look, that's divine providence.
Yeah, I think you're right. It is a really cool article. It's called Powers of the Other Shore, and it's by Siraj Giri, I think. I'm probably pronouncing it wrongly, so I apologize for that, but it is a very cool article, and it's a really kind of creative and clever investigation of the uses of imagination, and kind of gently encouraging Marxists to be a little open to how imagination plays a significant role in people's movements, especially among the oppressed classes. And there's a lot going on in it, a lot of different moving parts. You can read the article for free at monthlyreview.org if you want to check that out and follow along at home. We're not going to like talk through it point by point, but it is interesting because it draws on a lot of non-Christian sources And that's helpful for us to maybe create some points of contact with other ways of thinking on the left. And I think like Christians are really good at thinking about imagination and political imagination, sometimes to a fault, right? Like
It's like all we're doing.
exactly, exactly. It really is all we're doing. I mean, your favorite critical theologian in the United States right now is probably doing that right now, right? And like, it's not useless. I'm not trying to disparage it, but I think we can sometimes let that be a stand-in for actual politics. And this is I think, a great article just because it maybe helps us connect some of those dots. Like, if Christians are really eager to be thinking about imagination, then we should also be eager to try to figure out how to put that in dialogue with, real material movements and politics and so on. So we'll use this essay, this providential essay that was dropped right in Matt's lap at the exact right time, and we will take that as an opportunity to think about maybe political imagination, Christianity, politics, all with All Saints Day in the background. That's how we got here at the beginning.
It's a wild ride. Yeah.
But I think it goes together. By the end of this episode, it's definitely going to go together.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I mean, it's important because, okay, there's the old Marxist adage at this point. Maybe Frederick Jameson said it first. Maybe it was Slavoj Žižek. No one's quite sure. I'm actually pretty sure it's Frederick Jameson. But it's it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism, right? Like that is the sentence that everyone refers to when it comes to political imagination. And rightly so, right? I mean, it's easier to imagine, climate change killing us all and drowning in the rising seas than just to think of a different way of living our lives. And that is, I think, why political imagination is maybe so important, right? We have a whole lot of bad ideas here before us. And it would be great to stop spinning our wheels with those bad ideas and maybe think of a good idea, something that's a little bit outside the logic of the politics of capitalism. So, yeah, that's why political imagination is important. And of course, our ideologies, our faiths, and all kinds of other things are wrapped up in like what we see as possible in the world, right? So let's talk a little bit about this article. I don't, like Dean said, we don't need to like wade into the depth of it because there is a lot going on. And especially a lot of things that I don't know, maybe just it's like, too in the weeds to make the point that we want to make. But I do want to set it up just a little bit, and I'm not gonna read it word for word here because again, it's a lot. But the article is really rotating around a particular Indian colonial struggle in the 1800s. Okay. Man, I don't know very much about United States history. I definitely don't know very much about Indian history, and that is my own fault. But it is a fun thing to learn about, just a little bit, and it makes a cool point here. The article it revolves around a war, a particular colonial struggle in the 1800s between the British and I guess
the ruling class,
the ruling class of India. Sure, that's maybe a good way of putting it. Okay, so it revolves around this one particular figure named Mahar Sidnak, who is this like warrior of like this like sort of 19th century moment, and there's a lot of stuff going on with this particular person. He's actually fighting on the side of the British, which is kind of complicated. But he ends up becoming this sort of like figure for anti-caste struggle in India, and he's like a figure that's really like energizing to the youth of the movement. And um and, and that's like interesting, right? He's like this sort of like war hero that comes to symbolize a particular um idea about India, but the British colonial rule stuff is complicated. um and it's like kind of all happening in the background. But the particulars of the story, I guess this is sort of the interesting part of the article, is that the particulars of the story, like that he's fighting on sort of the colonial side, a lot of those things kind of fade into the background, and just the just sort of like the character of this particular person, Sidnak, kind of rises to the top. And even since then, this character has become, wildly popular again in India. The article makes reference to a handful of different YouTube channels, kind of like taking apart the story and like talking about it. It's like a folk tale in that sense, but even more than that, it's a part of like the larger, even like um the larger sort of culture of India. There's a movie on the horizon about this person, and the article is kind of getting into this particular figure because he's like a really mobilizing political figure. Despite sort of like some of the problematic background of this person, I mean, even for the contemporary moment. But it's kind of taking a look at like what's going on with like myth and history around this particular battle, around this particular person, and how is this like I don't know, making people interested in politics or in resistance to sort of a type of hegemony or something. And I know I've kind of butchered a little bit of this, but just because of the different cultural background, it's hard not to. And I think that's fine, I guess. But
Yeah.
it is like a really interesting kind of retelling of a really familiar story that I think we see all across Western culture as well. Though there are these characters that become larger than life. The details of their particular situation become less important than their what they mean to the larger movement. I guess what we're talking about here is like folk heroes and how um people's movements and political movements come to like take on the mythology of those people and use them in really interesting ways.
Yeah, for sure. And exactly, like the point is that if you just had the facts of the situation, it that would be fine, I guess. Like there's a place for that for sure. But the mythological character that kind of ignores all those facts is actually where all the energy is, right? The revolutionary energy is not in the facts of the story necessarily, but in what this person comes to represent or what this character comes to sort of mean for people. And obviously, this happens on the right and the left all the time, so it can be for better and for worse. But you could think of lots of examples, even in left wing history, right? Lots of leftist heroes, for lack of a better term, who, the finer points of their life or particular decisions that they make are questionable or problematic and so on. But they appear as kind of, looming, energizing characters. I mean, you could even maybe say the same of Marx in a lot of ways, right? Karl Marx, if you read a biography of him, there's lots to like about him. There's also some things to not like about Karl Marx and his life and decisions that he made. But nevertheless, he is a mythical character, right? He has changed the face of the world more than any other philosopher in the 1800s, I would guess, for sure. Maybe any other philosopher in history who could say, I don't know. I don't know how to evaluate it. The point is, if you just sort of read off the facts of a biography of a character, you're not really going to get moving, right? But people and events come to symbolize bigger and bigger struggles. And the article by this Indian scholar is looking at a particular situation in India where this has been the case. And there's this kind of folk hero that rises as a symbol of caste struggle and still today is a kind of, he is that torch that is being burned by the lower caste, and there's a lot of conflict around it already. So the idea is that Marxists shouldn't kind of look down on these things as, oh, that's like backwards or superstitious. And Marxists do have a tendency to do that. Marx and Engels both did it themselves in their own writing, and other people do too. But I think it's a great article kind of demonstrating with some concrete examples why we shouldn't be so quick to look down our noses at those kinds of popular displays of devotion. I don't know. There's some interesting resonances here as we were talking about All Saints Day, right? Like the sort of popular cult of saints that rise up that also are not really attentive to the particulars of their life necessarily, but that doesn't really matter, right? It's sort of it takes on a life of its own. It has a significance of its own, and people on the left and Christians especially should maybe be more willing to take that for what it is, to see it as symbolizing the power of a movement rather than the backwardness or the sort of unenlightened part of a movement.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I don't know. I think Marxists are wrong to do that. It's not an unenlightened part of the movement. It's like mythology can be a really catalyzing moment for resistance against all kinds of different very bad hegemonies. I don't know. I'm thinking of like everything we've ever talked about on this show in this sort of vein, right? Like, man, I couldn't even tell you which episode it is, but a long time ago we were talking about the like the appearance of the version of Guadalupe to indigenous women in Central America, or or like Joe Hill, or I mean Jesus. I don't know. Like this is the way that sort of like these mythical structures they crystallize around, I don't know, certain types of kind of like epiphany sort of events. I mean, whatever that might mean in any given situation. Whether it's like the murder by the state, like Joe Hill or Jesus, or like a miraculous apparition. These can be like really powerful moments for resisting power that I think, you can't just turn a blind eye to. You can't just say it's like, I don't know, backwards people. That doesn't quite work out, I don't think. um
Yeah.
yeah, well, let's talk about the article a little bit here. So I kind of stumbled through the beginning telling you the details of the story because it's like not really my story to tell. And that's fine. But when it kind of comes down to like the heart of the matter, the article talks about these characters that have this sort of like role in popular movements. They start talking about them as mythical epiphanies, and I think that's a really, I mean, kind of a magical phrase to use. But I'm like really actually excited about it. So I'm going to read this bit here, and I think it's a bit long, but it does get to like the heart of what's going on here. All right. So it goes like this: mythical epiphanies are interferences of extratemporal truth into the existence of those who think themselves to be enveloped in historical time. The interferences of extratemporal truth frees militants from historical time that then, in full felicity, the past can be accessed from within the bosom of the present. Oh, man. We're doing philosophy now. We're talking about history
That's
now.
right.
This is great. So there's a lot of words going on here for sure, but I mean, I think maybe we can break it down a little bit, right? So a mythical epiphany, this sort of moment where a character from the past becomes, sheds new light, sheds a new type of truth onto the moment of the present, right? That's kind of what we're talking about here. In this case, it's a soldier from the 1818s or whatever, like kind of giving new light to political struggle in India. It could be Joe Hill giving new light to the labor struggle in the United States. It could be the Virgin Mary appearing and telling you to tear the mighty from their thrones or whatever. Like all of these are that kind of what we're talking about, where there's an extra temporal truth, something that's not just, it wasn't true, it wasn't just true when it happened. It wasn't just true after it happened, but it's true now. It's sort of like outside the situation breaking in. And you think that you're in a historical sort of moment with all these specifics. What could somebody from the past possibly have to say? But surprise, it has a lot to say, right? There are all these ways that Joe Hill or Mary or Jesus or or Mahar Sidnak or whoever, right? They have a lot to say about the current situation. And now you can tell once it's happened. It's a really fascinating way to put it all, I think.
For sure. I think too that line that you read, that the interferences of extratemporal truth free militants from historical time. I think it's a wordy thing. Definitely, we're doing philosophy now, but I think it works. And it's important to kind of break that down too, right? There's this interference of something outside of time, some kind of truth that's being expressed that isn't contingent on getting the timeline straight or getting the timeline right. And when you can kind of find the truth that is offered up by a figure in the past, even if it's not a factual truth necessarily, the truth to which they bear witness, right? Like, for instance, the truth of liberation, or the truth that, a particular class relationship is oppressive, whether that's a caste system in India or a medieval feudal system in Europe or whatever it might be. When you can kind of see that the grain of truth that's present there, it frees you from your own historical time. So, it expands your imagination. I think you mentioned that quote earlier, Matt. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Capitalism is such a pervasive ideology. We see our world limited by the horizon of capitalism, like it's as far as your eye can go. And I think that's true even of how we view history. Like, intuitively, if you grow up in a capitalist society, I think it's easy to see capitalism as a natural outgrowth of history, right? This is where history got us. You'll hear it all the time from capitalist apologists. Capitalism is just the way that people are, right? It's the natural economic activity of human beings. Left to their own devices, if two people met in a field, they would be capitalists. This is the kind of history that we live in, basically. And so those flashes or interferences of some kind of truth that is outside of that timeline frees us up from that history, right? It expands the horizon a little bit. It maybe gives us a different scene of two people in a field, or like makes us ask better questions of like, where did these people come from in the first place? Who owns the field? I don't know. Like it gets us out of that abstraction, that kind of bad historical trap, and allows us to think history differently by virtue of what those kinds of mythical truths open up or allow us to access in the past.
All these people need to stop meeting in the field. They got to go somewhere else. Meet in a better place.
In the agora.
That's right. In the marketplace of ideas.
We're really doing philosophy now.
Okay. So this all sounds cool. I imagine you, the listener, you're like, wow, good stuff. I'm loving this. But are there any big objections you might be thinking? And yes, there are. So the article, Geary, the author of the article, turns to start talking about Rosa Luxemburg and like the Spartacist, so like the Spartacist League in Germany. I mean, it's now Germany. Wasn't then, I guess, exactly. Complicated history. There's a lot of moving parts here. Anyways, the Spartacist League, they Rosa Luxemburg kind of wrote about how they were using the figure of Spartacus as a historical figure to kind of do this thing, right? It's sort of like this sort of folk hero that is breaking in and giving new meaning to class struggle or whatever. And there is a little bit of rub there in Marxist analysis. For example, there's a little bit of a back and forth between Rosa Luxemburg and like using Spartacus as a figure to do socialism, and Georg Lukács, who is a very orthodox Marxist, but sometimes not. Anyways, Lukács kind of brings this point that this phrase I don't really find too helpful, but that using figures like Spartacus or whoever as a stand-in or as like a folk hero, as a quote unquote organicist.
Like one of the big disagreements with Luxemburg had this idea that revolution would sort of emerge spontaneously. I mean, I'm giving a read. So there are people who will not see Luxemburg saying this. Anyway, this was the disagreement within Marxism. That's why it's important. The disagreement was people read Luxemburg, fairly or unfairly, as putting a lot of faith in the spontaneity of the masses, right? That they would just kind of like catch the flash of revolution and do it organically. That's where organicist comes from. That you wouldn't have to have a big vanguard party to get them all in order. It would just kind of occur. And, that's not, for instance, what the Bolsheviks did, right? I mean, there's a dialogue to be had with the spontaneity of the masses, right? You can't ignore it. And there is spontaneity and so on. But you got to like make some big plans. You got to lead the masses as well. And there's this kind of weird conversation going there. So that's what Lukács is doing, at least, of being like, by holding on to Spartacus, you're sort of appealing to this organicist hero who just sort of emerged out of nowhere, right? In ancient Greece, out of the class contradictions that were present there, as opposed to organizing yourself around, a strategic plan, a political party, and so on. Not to say that they were part of a party and everything else, but where does the energy come from? I think that's the point of difference, at least.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good way to put it all, and pretty helpful. Well, Geary goes on to say though that the like the mythical character, right? The mythical epiphany that kind of appears is maybe not best thought of as organicist, right? Not but something different, something more strategic. So he writes this. It's not organicist, but it's part of a strategic movement of rupture that bears witness to the full density of historical oppression. It is not an easy gesture of freedom or liberty, but one graciously bearing the weight of the world and the burden of the past. So, I mean, this is, I think, actually negotiating that exact thing that you're talking about, Dean, though, like the, you know, do you lead the party or does it just happen or whatever? But I think this is it, right? This is like taking up a mythical character like that into your movement of politics or whatever. It's not organicist, but it is like it's strategic. It's using a particular character in a particular way, right? And like using that character to articulate a particular like historical dimension of the class struggle or of the struggle itself. I think that is a pretty fascinating way to put it, though. I mean, it's not just like I think this will end up being an important part when we get to the Benjamin portion. I mean, you can't talk about history without talking about Benjamin, but When it gets to the Benjamin part, the strategic part of this all is really important. This is not just
Mhm.
like an appeal to like, wasn't it like, it's not just an appeal to like how great was George Washington or something, right?
Yeah,
Like that's
yeah.
not the same thing. There's a sort of a strategy involved in using these like sort of mythic characters in class struggle.
Yeah, and it's there's a way of imagining Spartacus that fits into a strategic situation too, right? Marx famously loved Spartacus for what he represented about Rome. I think I said wrongly a minute ago. Did I say ancient Greece? Anyway, whatever. He's from Rome. It doesn't really matter. The point is,
It's all history back there. Who
it's
cares?
all history, but yeah, they're all the same. Um, but what I mean is, I guess there's a way in which you can activate any sort of character in history within reason toward those strategic ends, right? So it's not the article I think is really interesting because it's kind of like it's splitting a hair in Marxist theory, but like a very important one. Like
Hmm.
it's not being like, oh, they were wrong to kind of seize on that line through history that they wanted to pull into Germany through the Spartacist League or whatever, but rather to say this author is being like, I'm not saying Geary is saying I'm not saying oh, we just have to wait for folk heroes to emerge, but rather I'm saying there's a kind of strategic opportunity in the emergence of folk heroes, and they say something about the struggle itself, which is a very cool thing and a really, not exactly as orthodox Marxist as I think Geary wants us to believe, but I don't care. I think it's better. It's good.
Yeah, I think so too. That's great. Well, okay, so we don't have to stick with like Spartacus though. There are other other characters that do appear. So Geary turns into other characters who I guess maybe like the Western audience might be more familiar with. So he says, it might be quite sobering to keep in mind that Sidnak, which is the person kind of in this Indian context that's very important, is not the first mytho-political figure standing for the fight against oppression and injustice. Such figures as Spartacus, of course, have arisen many times before, but considering Sidnak's interface with Western colonial empire, it might be better to think of the Emiliano Zapata or the Haitian Francois Macandal, who are similarly located within those types of colonial situations or those kinds of struggles. So he goes on to say that the mytho-political character of Zapata or Macandal finds powerful articulation in the works of anti-colonial writers like Alejo Carpentier or Eduardo Galeano. What's up? Haiti's maroon rebel Macandal embodies tremendous mythical powers that Carpentier calls the powers of the other shore. Macandal's rebellion in 1751 is like the primal scene, not just for the later 1791 slave rebellion in Haiti, but one might dare say for all black rebellion and black power outside of Africa. Okay, well, I wouldn't want to contest that, but that's a really interesting articulation, I think, right? That it's here are some other examples we can kind of think through in, especially like the like a leftist anti-colonial struggle, right? There's Zapata in Mexico, and ends up being a really important figure for Eduardo Galeano and the Zapatistas, but also Macandal in Haiti, and I think that end line that's really interesting. I mean, the importance of Haiti in the slave rebellion, I think, can't be overstated. There's another essay, actually, or an interview in the same issue of Monthly Review about the importance of the Haitian Revolution and some things going on there. But there's a really fascinating part that I don't think had registered with me before I read the interview. Just the point was though that the Haitian Revolution, the overthrow of Haitian slavery, like kind of led to the Louisiana Purchase in the United States, and like there were all kinds of slave rebellions in the United States that were that were spurred on by um the now free Haitians in the United States, and that's just like really fascinating. I don't know. I don't think I there's a whole lot of more about this in like Black Jacobins and other places too, but man, there's a lot of really interesting interconnections there. Uh, within like the role that Haiti plays within I mean Black Rebellion I think is it. So yeah, I mean there's other examples of times where anti-colonial movements will pick up these characters that end up being larger than life but really important to those struggles and in a historically grounded way but also in a strategic way.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that is so fascinating, though. So you mentioned the phrase "the powers of the other shore," which of course is an important piece of the title of the article too. I think there's such an interesting moment in this article too, where he talks about something way beyond historical fact. He mentions that Mackandal, in the memory of him, there are all these kind of like magical qualities that he
Hmm.
possesses or miraculous events that happen around him, right? That there are these just not empirically verifiable events, to
Hmm.
put it lightly, right? And so if you're like a crude Marxist materialist, or indeed if you're Marx and Engels, you'd be like, oh, that's a bunch of like ornamentation, right? You got to get down to the very bare facts, and that's where you find the revolutionary impulse. But Geary does something cooler, I think. He writes about it saying, deep from within a hazy past, there often shines forth a hero figure, historical and mythical in equal measure. The figure exudes miraculous powers and fantastic possibilities. In the dense interrelationship between the past, present, and future, a fact lifted from the inner recess of history can suddenly acquire a kaleidoscopic, many sided meaning and resonance in the present.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Hell
there's
yeah.
something beyond just like getting the facts straight that makes a big difference. And this is true of the saints, right? Like, um the saints accrue these wild stories about them. They accrue miracles that are attributed to them, and whether we believe in them or not, the point is these aren't they don't belong to the kind of scientific materialist part of the way we might interpret other facets of the world. But nevertheless, we kind of know what's being said when we say, the saints had miracles attributed to them, or when we say even revolutionary figures have miracles attributed to them. Like I said, I'm not saying that like it's all fake and we all know that secretly behind closed doors. I'm like naively Christian enough to basically believe that, I don't know, saints do whatever we say they do. They fly around and bilocate and whatever. Sure, I don't know. The world is weirder than we know, but the point is like, whether or not they're true, right? What's really being said in that is that these are people of larger than life importance. They're extra temporal. They're somehow beyond history, outside history,
Hmm.
and that matters. And we see it even, I think, in like the most materialist left, right? Like, if you talk to a true believer communist about like Fidel Castro, you're going to hear some like very funny stories about how Fidel survived 1,000 assassination attempts, and like how doves landed on his shoulders, right? Like all these kind of like bizarre miraculous events that happened around
And that's
Fidel. And
that's completely different than a saint, right? It's not the same thing at all. It's it's just it's
yeah,
totally different.
it's totally different, we swear. Yeah, exactly. Right. But this is it. Or you get the same thing with whoever. Like, pick your favorite communist hero in history. Like, there are all these kind of stories, right, that kind of accrue toward them. And the point that Gary is making, I think, is that we don't have to actually be like, oh, that's bad and we shouldn't do that, but rather be kind of attend to functionally what's happening when that occurs. Like, what
Yeah.
is that really speaking about a struggle? And I think that is a really good way to, I don't know, get in the weeds with history and figure out what to do with it.
Yeah, I think so too. I really appreciate the just using the word kaleidoscopic in this context is a really
Hmm.
good a good descriptive phrase to talk about what's going on here. Um man, this is I don't know, it's probably a dumb and stupid revealing thing about myself, but like there's a moment in undergrad where I was like very interested in the historical Jesus movement. Um
Hmm.
which if you're not familiar, dear listener, it's like a bunch of nerds who are like, okay, well, I know it does say that Jesus rose from the dead, but maybe he didn't. And like, here's how we can know, or whatever. And it's like, sorry, that's my nerd voice. Um, different than my regular good voice.
Yeah.
But it's just like trying to get the historical facts or whatever only and kind of parse out all of like the what can we know about the gospels in this like only historical sided kind of view. And like I think that's actually really interesting and there's maybe some fun things to like be learned about that. But also it does kind of like it does rob a lot of the power from the stories and that is kind of a bummer. But anyways, all that to say, I appreciate the kaleidoscopic part because like what if you can pick up more of these types of meanings to like historical things or like I mean especially when they come to religion or something like what if you could pick up more of them at once or like hold things in tension or think about them in tandem with one another like through a kaleidoscope, right? You're like looking, it's spinning, it's like all kinds of different things at once and I really appreciate
Hmm.
that. Because I don't know, man, religion's a hard thing to think about. Um, and especially the miraculous stuff doesn't lend itself well to my brain particularly, but I guess I'm here for it because it's all just like, it's all there, and kind of have to come to accept that maybe.
Yeah, to me, it's just the weirder the better. If you can get it weirder and weirder in here, then you can actually start getting something done. That's how I feel.
Maybe.
Um, yeah, just going a little further here, and then we can get Walter Benjamin in the mix, I guess. But Geary says, it must be clear then that the past, as the powers of the other shore, or the marvelous in the real, is not something to be discovered through an objective investigation of the past. It is not at all a question of rationally reconstructing the facts of the present as they actually happened.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what we've been saying, but I think that's the key. It's like, yeah, I don't know. We could maybe figure out the historical Jesus and sort out which miracles were which and which ones we want to believe or could believe, or which ones test the limits of what our rational brains will tolerate. But it's also like, I don't know, Jesus told a bunch of pigs to run in the river and like they did it, right? Like that is way more fun to live in that universe. And it's about expanding those imaginative capacities,
Mhm.
because like we do live in a capitalist narrative that completely closes down any possibility outside of capitalism. And we can imagine wild possibilities in capitalism, right? Like go see a Marvel movie. It's like you can watch people fly around and like shoot lasers and go to space and like eliminate half the population of all the universe with a snap of a finger. You can do all that under capitalism, right? Like people just go back to work after that in those movies. And that's like part of it, right? So being able to expand our imagination in different directions that maybe don't lead to a world where you can imagine, Spider-Man, but you can't imagine socialism. I think that's important. And the powers of the other shore, whether it's in Marxist history or class struggle history or movement history or Christian history, it's important to kind of just allow ourselves to be open to what that does to create a little more elasticity in our brains.
Yeah, well, that's right, and that's actually a really important part of it too, though, right? Like, you could see Spider-Man as like one of these types of figures or whatever, and it would be really bonkers to do it though, because like Spider-Man fundamentally doesn't change, your identity in the world. It doesn't change like anything about your relationship to capital or whatever, right? Whereas Makandal does, right? If you're a Haitian person, that is like a completely altering character. Or if you're, I don't know, like whatever. Lots of different people can fill this role in different historical ways that are interesting. But like, you have to think too that some characters, some miraculous epiphanies. I'm sorry, some mythical epiphanies, they don't like foot the bill, right? Like just like I said a minute ago, right? Like this would be a very lame thing to do with like George Washington or something. It doesn't make any sense. There's nothing
Right.
strategic or like changing to your identity. It's just like, yeah, George Washington, he's great. I love this guy, and like that's why I'm gonna just keep being like a really good American or something. I don't know, right? There's like nothing there.
Yeah, although I guess the difference between Spider-Man and George Washington and Mackendall is,
A
like
wild
it's
sentence, but
important that
okay.
these people, yeah, yeah, wild sense for sure. But it's important that these people are real, right? Like you
Yeah.
can, like, there's something about Mackendall that locates him in history. The saints are, well, for the most part, located in history.
Kind of,
we
yeah.
we can believe that they are. um, Whereas like Spider-Man is not, right? It's the character of fiction or something. And there's something about that tie to the past that is also really constitutively important. And it's what makes a figure like Mackendall or Zapata so powerful, and what makes a figure like George Washington so dangerous, right? Like it's a historical precedent that we use to license our actions in the present, and which things we take as precedents and which things we take as bad presidents. Um,
Jeez.
that makes all the difference. I
Yeah.
think it really does matter.
Yeah, I think so. Well, let's talk more about that part of it because I think that's where things get really fascinating. So, Geary brings in Walter Benjamin, everyone's favorite philosopher of history. We've talked about Benjamin a lot on the show. I mean, I think anytime we talk about history, you probably do talk about Benjamin because he's like the guy. Anyways, let me read this piece and we can kind of talk through more of what you're saying here, Dean. As Walter Benjamin powerfully expresses, to articulate the past historically does not mean to recognize it the way that it really was. It means to seize hold of a memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. So this piece of Benjamin here is really important, because there's totally a place for historicism and like learning the facts. Like that's great. It's a great exercise for the nerds, and the rest of us can benefit from it too. But like when it comes to politics, that's not exactly what history is necessarily about, or not in this register of thinking at least, right? It's about seizing hold of a memory as it becomes relevant, right? And then like you do something with it. That is exactly the power of someone like Zapata or McCondall, or Joe Hill or whoever. um there's a moment where that memory becomes really important and it mobilizes people in a way that like probably nothing else would.
Yeah, I think that's right. And like we said, it matters kind of that you can locate these people in an identifiable past. And I think for Benjamin, what I've always found so interesting about Benjamin is that attention to the past. It's really easy to like people charge people on the left and Marxists and others with wanting to destroy all the past, right? To create a new world whole cloth, and like not always without good reason. I mean, there are currents on the left and in the history of communism and socialism that have been that way, and I don't know, they're not for me. But I like what Benjamin does, which is to say we have to find some way of being accountable to the past, being present with the past, making the past present, however you want to put it. And Geary, for instance, draws further on Benjamin by contrasting that with European fascism, which we sometimes also see as a kind of attempt to appeal to the past, but there's a way that it is tied more to the future in a kind of dangerous way, right? Like Geary pulls out all kinds of ways in which like the Nazis were really invested in electrifying the working class, like pulling them into a highly technologized future and so on. So not preserving the idyllic character of peasant life in rural Germany or whatever, but sort of turbocharging the working class to violent and genocidal ends, right? It is the combination of industrialism and absolutely horrifying reactionary politics.
Yeah, I mean, the
And
same thing could be said of like Italian futurism or something as well, right? It's
yeah,
all about like going fast and blowing stuff up, and
exactly.
your mom's great Italian villa is like not it, right? We want a future with like brutalist buildings and tanks.
Exactly. And, we can talk more about that in a minute because I think some of that maps on in interesting ways with Christofascism and evangelicalism, and some of it has to be kind of said differently. But
Yeah.
it's important, though, because it's a good contrast to what Benjamin is doing in that context, right? He's saying, well, I don't want that. Like, I don't want to turbocharge the world and forget about the past. On the contrary, Benjamin wants to find a way of authentically kind of bringing the past with us, right? Or finding a way to redeem the past. And it's also what separates Benjamin not only from the fascists, but from the social democrats. So Geary has this great paragraph where he quotes Benjamin. He says, Benjamin absolutely nails it when he describes how social democracy thought fit to assign the working class the role of the redeemer of future generations, in this way cutting the sinews of its greatest strength. This training made the working class forget both its hatred and its spirit of sacrifice, for both are nourished by the image of enslaved ancestors rather than that of liberated grandchildren. Geary says, as a peer redeemer of future generations with no basis in the history of past oppression, the supposedly forward-looking working class was bereft of the sinews of its greatest strength. It was fighting fascism asininely without anger, without a sense of hatred or revenge, only to often cross over to the other side. Could we say that Benjamin here is warning us against the wavering and capitulating anti-fascism that would follow from rational history and rational politics? Right? So the key here is to allow the past to become so large in our consciousness that we seize it and see ourselves as accountable to it. And I think this is such an important point. It is what drives me endlessly up the wall about like other, not just social democrats, but like certain brands of socialism that are out there these days, right? Like fully automated luxury space communism. It is exactly this. It's the dream of the future liberated grandchildren, kind of everybody gets an infinity pool politics. But Benjamin's goes in the opposite direction, right? It's I've seen the suffering of other human beings. I'm remembering the suffering of other human beings, and there has to be an account for that, right? There has to be some kind of way of settling those scores. And of course, Christians have things to say about things like revenge and hatred and all the rest of it. But I think it's really important to preserve exactly what Benjamin and Geary are saying here, that an authentic kind of socialism is actually rooted in sort of the cry of the past, right? The cries that are accumulating every single day that passes by into an even bigger past full of suffering. That's sort of the motivation for building a better world, not a totally abstracted Marvel movie version of socialism, I guess, if you will.
Yeah, I think that's really it's really fascinating. Yeah, the grounding is really important. And okay, I don't know. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of dunking on luxury space communism, because man, in some ways it seems like a really great idea, but on the other hand, you're right. I think that having that grounding in history is really important. Let's talk about this for a minute though, because the picture of fascism that we do get here is actually maybe different than the picture of fascism we often paint on this podcast. The fascism of like like I said, of Italian futurism or of the Nazis or whatever. You can see it plenty of places in the United States, I suppose. But when we talk about fascism on the Magnificast, we're often focusing on Christian fascism, Christo-fascism, if you will, to coin a term. Well, to coin someone else's term, it's fine.
To borrow Dorothy's away list
Exactly.
term.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. But anyways, I think it's important because that type of fascism is something that's a little bit different. There's a little bit of a different aesthetic to it. It's not quite the way that it appears here, and that is actually important to parse out because Christofascism is, it's about a sort of like a gradual wading into fascism that you accept, not because it's like an immaculate vision of the future, but because it's it relies on a familiar nostalgia of white supremacy or something. It's relying on the history that not of your liberated not of your liberated children in the future who get infinity pools and socialism, but it's like the nostalgia for a time where like white people only were in charge or something. So I guess that might be worth thinking through a bit more here.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's something about the past that is important to Christofascism as well, and of course, whatever, important to Nazis and the Italians and everybody else. But
But who cares about their feelings?
Yeah, and not me. But the weird thing about Christofascism is that there's also a way that they're doing something similar. They're seizing on fake moments in the past, right?
Mhm.
They don't care about the rational interpretation of history. They're kind of making it up, and with great success, right? They're doing a better job than we
Listen,
are.
JFK's still alive, and he's going to come back any minute.
Any minute, and he would vote for Donald Trump, right? So there's that part of it that is definitely present. But I think there is also an important future part that maybe still makes them the inverse of luxury space communism in a weird way, which is to say evangelicals also are imagining, and Christofascists generally, they are imagining a future for liberated grandchildren, right? I mean, explicitly in many cases, it is a literal fear over the future of their grandchildren. But for them, the fear is not like climate change or that capitalism will grind their grandchildren into dust or whatever. It's a fear that they'll be taught that, I don't know, trans people exist, right? Or that you should account for like racial justice in our world and build a political system that is oriented toward it, right? There's this sort of ultimate driving concern with the safety of the future generation that kind of binds it in this weird way too to that strange left-wing fantasy of the future. So I guess all that to say, Christofascism is so weird because I guess it inherits that same fascist impulse that Benjamin noted, that kind of fake future that it wants, the dream of liberated grandchildren, but it also adds on to that this really important rooting in the past.
Mhm.
So the future is supposed to look like an imagined version of the past in this important way.
Yeah, exactly. A very racist retrofuturism. There you go.
Right. As opposed to, the difference with the sort of left-wing usage of the past is you're not trying to restore anything,
Right.
because what would you restore? It would be another situation of class oppression, right? That we're trying to overcome those kinds of antagonisms and inequalities. And so it's not about making the past come back. It's about activating the moments in the past that are flinging us toward some kind of situation in which we can try our best to redeem those past injustices or sufferings.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's leveraging a particular figure of the past to like make sense of revolt in the present or something, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's really interesting. I mean, it's where it's different, right? You're taking someone from the margins, who was struggling against whatever hegemonic power, colonial or otherwise, and reinterpreting it into the moment. I mean, it's clearly different than yeah, the liberated grandchildren of into a more white supremacist society or something. Okay, let me
Hmm.
read the conclusion here from Geary, and we can kind of talk it out and see what else there is left to say. So he writes, the past appears in its immediacy in the present. It's not about collecting or documenting these past struggles or putting it all down in history books as rational knowledge, but of how they speak in and through present struggles, refracted and recirculated through the world. Rational history and rational politics easily lend themselves to the acceleration of capital, with the vast majority, workers, the precariat, or even the middle class, apparently moving with the current or riding the wave. This is the recipe for a fascist futurism, underpinned by the glories of a mythic past. The mythic epiphany of the rebel taking over the city and Macandal or Sidnak or the powers of the other shore powerfully block this fascist futurism. Here's a dialectical movement powered by the depth and density of the memory of historical oppression, such as the insight of historical materialism. This is not, however, just an intellectual insight. It is inseparable from the political injunction and sequence of the Bhima Koragan, which is the battle that this is all kind of stemming from in the Indian context. It beckons a commensurate political practice. So I think this is kind of the conclusion that we were getting to, but said in a far more eloquent way. um, that the fascist politics are going to leverage an imagined past for the future for the liberated grandchildren, like we were saying, and on the other hand, the mythic epiphany is is trying to find ways that the Makandal or Sidnak or Zapata or anyone can kind of speak anew to a current situation. From the margins against power, these kinds of things. So I don't know, Dean. I feel like we started off the conversation with talking about the saints and talking about Christianity and the ways that I don't know, political imagination comes into the Christian political discourse. Where does this all leave us? Do you think?
Yeah, I really like thinking about this stuff in particular, thinking about how to make the past active. I really like thinking about archives and what's going on back there and digging around and figuring out who you can find and what you can find and what that gives you permission to do or be today, right? And one theologian I really like, I've probably mentioned this before, is Johann Baptist Metz. Not without his problems, but he was a German Catholic theologian who read a lot of Walter Benjamin and tried to sort of think through the church in a lot of those terms. And he thought of Christianity as kind of a repository for a dangerous memory, as he put it. So the church kind of has this memory that is always messing it up. Like it can become as controlling and cold as the machinations of bureaucracy and wealth and power and everything else will allow the church to become. But nevertheless, there are these hot coals at the bottom, right? These the memory of Jesus as a radical person, the memory of all kinds of radical saints, whether it's Saint Francis or Oscar Romero or whoever else it might be. There are these kind of dangerous memories under there that threaten even the stability of the church. And I think, or at least the stability of the church that has, tried to kind of cover those hot coals over. And I think that is a significant thing for Christians on the left, right? It's like, what are the dangerous memories that we can kind of activate, the mythical epiphanies in the saintly tradition that we can find, make them operative and usable for now. I think that is a very cool way to kind of keep thinking about All Saints Day, what's going on back there, how to operationalize that stuff, make it present in an important way. I don't know. That's how I That's what gets me going. What about you, Matt? What are we supposed to do with these saints?
Yeah, I'm never quite sure. I mean, I think what you said is right. That makes a lot of sense. When it comes to thinking through the ways that institutions hold memory or like hold information, even like, every institution finds a way to tell its own story. Um,
Hmm.
and you think of like the church as a type of archive. I think that's right. I mean, it is. To me, though, the thing that always strikes me is that like archives in some way have to be about access to those archives.
Hmm.
And, like, okay, for the Zapatistas and, like, or, the figure of Zapata or Macandal or whatever, those figures, I mean, they would not be hard to find in the archive of the moment, right? It's like, well, it's, a person who led a slave revolt or, yeah, or whatever, these are like figures that are not just like linked to the history of the people that are like living them through not just geography but about the sort of cultural stories that they would tell and all this kind of stuff. But I guess like to me the thing that seems hard to parse is exactly like I don't know, like where do you find all of these people? I mean, like in the West and like sort of in the core of the empire or whatever, it's a little bit harder to figure this part out. Like, who are the saints? Who are the mythic people that will just like come to us? And I guess it's like it's a harder question to answer. It's like how do we access that part of our own archive or whatever?
Hmm.
Without being like culturally appropriative or weird or bad in some kind of other way. Always a
The three things you shouldn't be.
yeah, weird, culturally appropriative, or bad. You don't want to be any of those things. All I'm trying to say here is that, like, I think this is a really cool idea, but man, the archives is bad sometimes. Like, how do you,
Yeah.
it's just like you wander the stacks looking for somebody good, and all you can find is
Yeah.
Spider-Man.
Yeah, but that's the thing, right? Is the archive is always full of contradictions. Or for the way I always like to put it is for every Saint Constantine, right, the consolidator of empire, there's also a Saint Anthony, right, the monk who goes out into the desert and rejects the urban life entirely, and that's just it, right? They're both floating around in there, and you have to grab the one that flashes up in a moment of danger, like Benjamin puts it, right? Constantine doesn't flash up in a moment of danger. St. Francis of Assisi might, maybe. He does for me anyway. I don't expect him to do that for everybody, but yeah, it's kind of just allowing those things to appear when they need to appear, when the epiphany needs to happen.
Yeah, I guess that's kind of part of my point though, is that you have to like learn how to tell these stories for yourself, and that can be a
Yeah,
complicated thing.
yeah.
And then communicating them to other people, like I don't know, the moment arises and Gerard Winstanley is your man, and they have to tell everyone around you like why this weird English guy is like the go-to. All right, all to say, it's not without complication, but I guess you gotta stumble around the archives for a little bit sometimes.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/the Magnificast, and there you will find an archive of lots of other podcasts that we have done. We do a podcast called The Lock-In, usually pretty frequently. It's been a little hit or miss lately, but that is life for you. It's a podcast about current events. We do some jokes and so on, so you can check that out at our Patreon. There's a Discord and lots of other stuff going on. You can follow us on Twitter and Facebook and everything else. You can send us an email if you want, I guess. Our music is by Amaria Armstrong, and our outro is by The Illogical Spoon. We'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up where you and keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. East side, what else?